That's another fundamental question of existence. And people who've become truly malevolent answer that question in the affirmative. They say, it's too much, we should destroy it. Now, I wouldn't say they're precisely doing it only for humanitarian reasons, but you have to understand and appreciate the logic. It's not irrational, that's the other thing. It's not irrational to work for the destruction of being. It's not irrational. In fact, it might be the most rational thing you could come up with. Depends on your initial set of presuppositions. So, Jung, down into the belly of the beast, so to speak, to see what lurks in the imagination. He sees the birthplace of archetypal ideas. Well, what are archetypal ideas? They're patterns of, you could think about them as representations of patterns of adaptive behavior. And so then you might ask, well, where did they come from? Well, that's part of what I've been trying to teach you about. They evolved, as far as I can tell, right? They evolved collectively, is that our society, and this is the dominance hierarchy idea. Dominance hierarchies set themselves up as a matter of course. They're the standard way that animals organize themselves in a territory. Well, okay, human beings are watching those dominance hierarchies since we became self-aware, thinking, what the hell are we up to? What the hell are we up to? And there's a question that lurks in there. What constitutes acceptable power? What constitutes acceptable sovereignty? Who should lead? Who should rule? What should be at the top? Well, we talked about that. The Mesopotamians figured that out. Speech and vision, that's Marduk. Speech, vision, and the willingness to confront the terrible unknown. That's what should rule. Well, what? Is that an arbitrary idea or is that a great idea? How could it be any other way? Well, that's what human beings are like. And I don't think that you can read the Mesopotamian story and understand the reference, which isn't an easy thing to do, and fail to draw that conclusion. Marduk has eyes all the way around his head. He speaks magic words. He goes off to fight Tiamat, the dragon of chaos. Well, what's that? That's the reptilian predator that lurks in the unknown. Well, is any of that, is there anything about any of that that stands in opposition to what you would presume if you were just analyzing our situation from a purely biological perspective? We're prey animals, we're predators. We've been threatened by reptiles forever. Why wouldn't we use the predator that lurks in the dark forest or the water as a representative of the unknown? Why wouldn't we harness that circuitry? We already have it at hand, and even more to the point, how could we do anything else? It makes perfect sense. Well, so then you might say, well, what would you want to be king? You could say king of the world or king of your own soul. What do you want to subordinate yourself to? How about your heroic willingness to encounter the unknown and articulate it and share that with people? There's no nobler vision than that. And I don't see that it's merely arbitrary. And it's not merely arbitrary too, because if you do that, to the degree that you do that, assuming your society isn't entirely corrupt, you will be successful. It will actually aid you practically. You'll rise up above men. You'll be selected by women. You'll be admirable. You'll be valued. And you know that because if you look at the people that you admire and value, again, unless you've taken a detour into dark places and are possessed with admiration for people who are working for malevolent purposes and for destruction, you just have to watch the people that you admire and try to figure out what's common across them and draw your own conclusions. And you can ask yourself too, when you're torturing yourself with your conscience because you're not doing what you should be and you know it, what is it that you're torturing yourself in relationship to? You have a vision of your own ideal and you torment yourself if you're not matching it. What's the ideal? Well, you don't know, right? It's kind of incoherent and poorly articulated, but that doesn't mean it isn't trying to manifest itself and make itself known to you. It's really the purpose of religious education, is to make that ideal articulated. Well, we've lost that. It's not a good thing. Okay, so I talked to you about the Mesopotamian story. And I talked to you about the Egyptian story and what I thought it meant. And it's a bit of an elaboration on the same theme because it says, well, the hero isn't only the the deity, the transcendent pattern, let's say, that goes out into the unknown, cuts it into pieces, and makes the world. That's not good enough because it only deals with the terrible mother. That's one way of thinking about it. But there's a terrible father too, once culture gets instantiated in large scale. And the Egyptians had that problem. Two problems. Chaos. Second problem, pathological order. Well, structures tend towards pathological order. The Egyptians laid out why. That's Seth, right? Seth is the evil advisor of the king who's lurking in the background all the time, trying to tear the structure down for his own malevolent purposes. So now and then that overcomes the structure and destroys rigidifies and makes malevolent the entire social structure. So it degenerates into, say, fascist totalitarianism, something like that. And that's been a threat since we've had highly organized societies. Then the hero ends up in the underworld and has to come back and do direct combat with that malevolent force at the price of his own consciousness, right? Because Horus gets one of his eyes destroyed. It's no bloody joke to face the forces that make a culture rigid and malevolent. So there's an addition to the hero archetype. Two things happen. One, you go out and you conquer chaos and you make order out of it. But the second is you take pathological order, recast it into chaos, and then allow it to reemerge. And you do that not in some arbitrary sense, but in tandem with your rescued father. And that's, I guess, in part what Nietzsche missed, as far as I can tell, is he knew of the death of God. Perhaps he didn't know that it had happened many times. Mircea Eliade documented that across many cultures. But what Nietzsche didn't seem to lay out, at least in his vision of the Superman or the Overman, was that it was a responsibility of the person who wants to revivify the culture to go down and rescue the damn culture, which is what you're supposed to be doing in university, because your father is lying dead in the libraries, right? So you're supposed to be going in there and taking that spirit out of the books and manifesting it in your own being. That's what the universities were for, although I don't think that's what they're for anymore. So we talked about the Mesopotamian story and we talked about the Egyptian story, and other people have documented the emergence of hero mythology in cultures far more diverse than the ones that I'm exposing you to. That was done most popularly by Joseph Campbell. But I don't think Campbell had a single idea that he didn't derive from Jung. And I'm not saying that in a critical manner, because Campbell was good at standing as a mediator between Jung and a more general population. He did, and that's a non-trivial accomplishment, seriously. But Jung is still the source of those ideas, and if you're serious about them, that's the person that you have to go to for that kind of knowledge. So now I wanted to tell you some other stories that are in some sense closer to Western culture. They're the stories upon which Western culture is actually predicated. So I'm going to tell you, I'm not only Western story today, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from Genesis, and I'm going to tell you about the story of the Buddha. I'm going to do that at the same time because the story of the Buddha is almost a perfect parallel, structurally speaking, to the story of Adam and Eve. And so I want to show you that, and you can decide for yourself if I'm imposing a pattern on it, because God only knows, right? Or whether or not, once you have the key to understanding the stories, which I hope I provided you with the, the idea of the dragon of chaos and the great mother and the great father and the individual, it gives you a schema that you can use to understand the characterizations of great stories. And as far as I can tell, it works pretty much universally across stories. So I want to walk you through those foundational stories. And I would say one of the things to know about the way the Bible is structured, there's a couple of things you want to know about it, is that it was authored by multiple people across extraordinarily vast spans of time, and then aggregated by other people and sorted into something that seemed to make sense. And so you can really think about it because Bible is a library. It's a library of books. It's not a book. The library is organized a certain way that makes a kind of sense, but it's not exactly as if anyone decided what that sense would be. It's the collaborative work of hundreds and thousands of people across thousands of years attempting to organize a collective story into something out of which the sense emerges. It's like human beings acted, and then they dreamed about how they acted, and then they wrote down what they dreamed about how they acted, and then they organized what they wrote about how they dreamed they acted. And that's how that book came into being. And the information that's within it emerged from the behavioral level upward, right? Rather than being imposed top down. Now there's a feedback, right? Because if you understand how you act, then that changes how you act. And so you can't avoid the top-down feedback, but a tremendous amount of the information in there, and this is why it's revelatory information, we don't know. It's in there because how we act is informative. And then if you represent how we act, that's informative. But the information came from how we act, not from the representation of how we act. And then you might think, well, how did we learn how to act? And the answer is, we've been trying to figure out how to do that for 3.5 billion years. There's lots of information encoded in our actions and in our social interactions, way more than we understand. So we're acting something out. We don't understand what it is, but we're doing our best to pull that information upward, partly by dreaming about it. That's what you're doing at night. You're trying to figure out what the hell you're up to. Well, you don't know because you don't know yourself in totality. How could you possibly know? Best you can do is dream yourself up and then speak yourself into some sort of articulated existence. It's just an approximation because whatever you are, rapidly supersedes whatever you think you are. That's why people constantly shock themselves, you know. If you were only what you thought of yourself, well, wouldn't life be simple? You'd know exactly what you were doing all the time, and you could even control your own behavior. Well, good luck with that. You can't do that for yourself, much less for other people. So let's go through these stories. So they're sequenced. People are trying to make sense out of them. They're aggregating these stories from all sorts of different places, all sorts of different tribes, all sorts of different times, and then trying to make them coherent without losing the content and without doing arbitrary editing. And so part of the reason that the Bible is full of internal contradictions is for the same reason that a dream is full of internal contradictions. Is if you impose too much coherence on it, you start losing the... Look, imagine that you have a impressionist painting. Well, it's messy and the image emerges, and you might say, well, we could replace that with a nice clean line drawing or even a sequence of stick figures and get the basic point across. It's like, well, you would, but you'd lose the richness. The unarticulable richness would be lost in the premature attempt to bring logical closure to the phenomena. And so, in fact, we know already that that's maybe the difference between dreams and waking thought. So, waking thought sacrifices completeness for coherence, right? So, whereas dream thought sacrifices coherence for completeness. And that's not something I'm saying arbitrarily. This is something that has been thought through by people who've been thinking this sort of thing through for a long time. Precise thought excludes too much. An imprecise thought is not sufficiently coherent. So we do both. Precise thought, left hemisphere, linguistically mediated, sequential, logical. Incoherent but complete thought, imagistic, emotion-based, right hemisphere. The right hemisphere even has a more diffuse structure. It's like the right hemisphere is trying to get a picture of everything. Now, it's not going to be a very detailed picture because it's a picture of everything, full of contradictions. But at least it's a picture of everything. And the left says that's not good enough for precise action. And it's not. So we'll narrow that to precision. But we lose the richness. But you need both. So there's an interplay. Well, the documents that the Bible is composed of are half dream and half articulated thought. And they have the advantages of articulated thought and the advantages of the dream, but also the disadvantages of both. So it's to the degree that it's articulated, it's in a dogmatic box. To the degree that it's a dream, it's still incoherent. But the problem is you have to move through the entire world even though you don't know it in detail. So you need detailed knowledge where detailed knowledge is necessary, and you need vague but complete knowledge where that's necessary. It's a very uncomfortable balance, but we have to face everything even though we don't understand anything completely.